Hi everybody, welcome to the Disruptive Diner. I'm Dan Roos with Openly Disruptive. Today is Tuesday, May 20th, 2014. Our topic is Foreshadowed by Fiction. For those of you that are joining us by live stream or that are watching the archive, the format of the Disruptive Diner is that we have a topic every month that we've been exploring in our discussion guide and in some podcasts and some other content. And today we have two great speakers. We had a third, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about why he couldn't join us today. I think he's got probably a better excuse than most of us do. But the topic today is Foreshadowed by Fiction, and this came up by the question, how do you come up with ideas for innovation, or where do people explore the future, how things work? So we actually have two great people here today that actually have really interesting perspectives in that place. The first is Mark W. Tiedemann, who's here to my left, to your right, and he is going to talk to us about his take on it. He's a published author who's going to take us take us on a journey to look at what we know about our relationship with robots and how that's evolved over time, really through fiction and through through our culture and everything. And then we're going to, with Michael White, who's a genetics researcher, take a look at a specific subset of how we can learn about our biotech future and where that takes us. Through some examples he's going to give. The format of this is the Pachachkacha format, which means each presenter has been given 20 slides, 20 seconds each. They automatically advance. That's terrifying to some people. It's actually great for everybody, and we're going to have a lot of fun. What it does is it makes all of us present a lot of energy, get to the point, and get to some discussion, because what we really want to do is talk about what are the implications of this? How can we use these things? But that said, neither one of these guys have ever presented this format before, so cut them some slack. And if things don't work well, it's okay, because we're going to have a great discussion. If you have questions, you can tweet them to @DanRoos, @DanReus. You can text them to me at 314-496-3457, or you can email them to me, and we'll have the discussion going. We have people watching the live stream from several cities around the U.S. and actually some people that are starting to gather into communities. We have a discussion guide that everybody that's signed up for the session should have received by email. We also have some hard copies here. But first, I'm going to introduce Mark. So Mark, as I said, published writer, you got an anthology coming out.
Short story collection coming out.
Short story collection coming out this month. And he is going to talk to us about our relationships with robots and what we can learn from fiction and where we've gone, and kind of how that all works together, and maybe isn't quite as obvious as you think.
No.
So, that said, are you ready, Mark?
I'm ready.
All right, so you get over here, and I'm going to hit go, and you're on.
The future always begins with a blank page. Freestyle, prose poem, epic, or parable. Tomorrow is an inevitability of the imagination, and no one knows how the story will end. The future is the place where we've been living since we invented timekeeping and started writing stories about it as if it were a real place. But we have to start somewhere. And Isaac Asimov is as good a place as any. He wasn't the first science fiction writer to come up with robots. That honor could arguably be given to Mary Shelley's creature, who came shambling onto the scene in the 1810s. But he was the one who gave an important imprimatur to the concept. Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, a logic tree of mandates machines should obey in order to preserve and protect their creators, set his robots apart from all the rest and established a high bar for all that came afterward, whether good or evil. They bound these marvelous devices to our will, to our service, and guaranteed that we would never have to go to war with them. Also, that we would never have to compete with them, since part of the obedience was that they would never supplant human beings. Having grown up on science fiction, so much so that I decided I wanted to write it, robots have been a constant in my personal vision of what the future will be like. Decidedly, it hasn't quite turned out that way. Robbie was the first one to fully realize, for a lot of people, myself included, what a robot should be. Big, strong, friendly in an English butler sort of way, the best friend of young ladies in need of an unpresumptive guardian. Robbie was ahead of its time in many other ways, which did not become obvious until recently. For a long time, this was the model, the prototype, the goal. The idea that a robot might replace a flesh and blood partner in the heart of some has continued as a tantalizing theme and may yet find more solid example in the mechanisms of the future. Maybe we've been trying to rehabilitate Frankenstein's monster ever since, instinctively knowing that once conceived, human ingenuity will eventually make what is imagined real. Resulting in Asimov, a walking, talking example of the promise of Asimov's prognostications. Once Asimov walked onto the technological stage, how many people thought the future was finally about to arrive? Now we have one walking around serving drinks. How long before we build one that will drive the car, do the shopping, take care of the lawn, and repair the roof? Not quite noticing, perhaps, unless we happen to be in an industry where one has already displaced us, that robots of very useful and tangible capabilities have been with us for some time now. But these angular collections of components don't look anything like what we've been waiting for. Who wants something that looks like a piece of roadworking equipment hanging around the house, even if it can do most of the chores? The trap is the ambiguity of the idea of helping. Helping with what? Labor-saving devices are all well and good, but how much labor of what kind do we hand over to machines? We're now making machines that already know what to do and can reprogram themselves for new tasks. It's fair to ask the question then, what will they need us for? This is von Neumann. Science fiction has embraced his ideas. We love the whole concept of the von Neumann machine, which is basically a machine which can replicate itself. Mainly, however, von Neumann was interested in computers and computer architecture, and his ideas have opened the door to artificial intelligence, which is another subject science fiction loves. We love it because science fiction is nothing without ideas to turn over and inside out. Ideas about things we haven't done yet, things we may not even have thought about yet. And this is one at the very heart of human obsessions, one that we've been playing with since Mary Shelley's monster ambled across the literary scene. There are many ways to pose the question, but maybe the best way is the least polite way. What makes us think we're so special? Special as in irreplaceable, as in unique, as in having no real need to justify our existence. We are the thinking animal. We build things. We construct worlds both to live in and to compare and to play with ideas. We make our own reality. And then imagine threats from outside, invading, trying to undo our masterpieces. Threats are unifying. Threats are inspirational. Threats drive us. Threats make great drama, and we've written great stories about fighting off the nemesis. In the meantime, we build more, never quite understanding that we are the biggest threat of all. Our stories are taking us to a solution in which we become our own creation. To defeat the threat, we become one with it and turn the outsider into us, or us into the outsider. In either case, the distinction between creator and creation is blurring. We began writing stories about our own Adams and Eves, but to make sure we knew the difference, we didn't trespass too far into off-limits preserves. We made them obvious, so we get the menace of the machine, bipedal slaves so distinctly artificial, no confusion could result. But the more you work at an idea, the more it becomes your fantasy. The more you want it to be perfect, and so the machine becomes closer to the ideal. After all, wouldn't we like to remake each other to fit our own expectations? If we can't have the perfect companion, maybe we can build one. But while fantasizing about such godlike possibilities, what we really end up building are machines that look more like this and do things for us we never imagined ever wanting a machine to do. Machines that fix our bodies, pave our roads, build our world, cook our food. More and more, they even decide how, to the point of rebuilding themselves to do the job even better. And the better they get, the more we have to ask ourselves, where are we going? So Asimov may yet have been the model, binding these marvelous things to our very being. We may find ourselves living in a city of machines, being cared for and protected, our needs, even our whims, met with unquestioning loyalty and efficiency. But to make sure they get it right, they have to understand us even better, and we have to teach them. Is it possible to teach a machine the utility of a playground so that it will understand what it is we need one for? So that we never forget the whole point of all our endeavors is to be more ourselves. To do that, maybe we have to become more machine, and so the machine will become more us. Bringing us, finally, to that indeterminate future, finally, where we have all options open, all possibilities to hand, and yet have no idea how anything will play out. Mind is a nebulous concept, one that encompasses as well as expands and shapes as it is shaped. In science fiction, the question is always, what will we want to do tomorrow?
All right. So if you have questions or comments and you're watching remotely, as I said earlier, tweet or text them to me. But first, I'd like to just say a couple things. What I really liked that you did was, you know, it's almost like it's helping us prepare ourselves for something that's coming. You know, it's like, so, I mean, you're talking about, you know, what is our relationship with robots and everything. Well, I mean, our relationship with robots or machines or whatever is as much how, you know, our side of the relationship as it is anything else. And
Oh, yeah.
so I think that's a really powerful way to think about it. So what do you think about this idea? And when Michael gets up here and talks, he's going to talk a little bit more about the state of biotech. But you know, one of the things that you brought up is, I don't think I would have necessarily thought of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's monster as a robot. But when you get down to it, what was it? It was like finding a bunch of parts, putting them together, and trying to make a companion, you know, this useful companion to help in some, you know, help in air quotes in some kind of way. So interestingly, you know, we had that model, and then we have, you know, the very mechanical, and then electronic, and you know, all of those kinds of things, you know, and then finally the nanotech version, and now we're actually kind of moving back to like biologically inspired kinds of things that we might have actually come full circle. That her piece might actually look way more relevant in 50 years than, you know, than this period of, you know, that we thought, oh, robots are going to be these tin things and they're going to do those things. So talk a little bit about what do you think when you observe, so you walk down the street, or unfortunately if we hear whatever that trash truck or whatever was right behind us for a second, but talk a little bit about how you think a human's relationship with a machine has changed just in the last 10 or so years. Because, I mean, don't you think that what you're describing is kind of a macro trend and a big long arc, but that's really kind of happening on a microcosm on a daily basis, right?
Siri.
Siri, go ahead and talk about that a little bit.
Basically, Siri is a robot in function, if not in form. It's a useful assistant, and we're treating it that way, and we've anthropomorphized it so that it sounds like a person. We're having a conversation with a machine, telling it what we want, and it provides within its capabilities. How many people are lost without their iPhones? And how many people are going to become emotionally dependent to some extent? We've already got that film that came out, Her, which, you know, and which is not really that unusual. People have been having emotional relationships with their machines, with their cars, or their ships, their boats. That's what people do. We anthropomorphize. Now we have the capacity to actually build things that do, in fact, look like what we want them to look like, and still do those things. We're all going to be twinned at some point, I think. Twinned. There will be the biological, and then there will be our avatar, who may be mechanical, may be a cyborg, may be just software that is constantly with us, constantly watches the stuff that we're not paying attention to. And, you know, the reminder list, the personal assistant that used to be the joke in some of the British plays, where he or she's always walking behind the impatient magnate going, well, you have this appointment, this appointment, this. Couldn't function without her, right? Well, now it's in a box. We're giving half of our memory over to some of these things.
Well, it's kind of interesting. So, and if anybody here in the room has a question, let me know and I'll pass the mic. But, you know, so the secretary, you know, the harried secretary or assistant, whatever, following on, that's a caricature. I mean, that's a symbolic way to capture a whole lot of.
Sure, and now we can make one.
All right, so do you have thoughts on, you know, from your own personal life, you know, so one of the things I think is fascinating that is you can explore these areas whether you use Siri or not, you know, you kind of observe that. So, you know, if you saw Her or you've seen somebody using Siri, what do you think is interesting about that in that kind of that larger story you were telling about, you know, what is help?
Well, my first thought is what was displaced? I mean, what does that replace that person used before? And if in fact it was a person, then what does that do for the emotional lives that we're leading, that we're going to be leading?
So this presentation, I had a question, because in a lot of times I've seen literature and a lot of people make a very strong binary distinction between humans and robots. Could you address a little bit more the symbiosis of when a robot is actually an extension or a facilitation of a human being?
That's in my opinion, that's a very fuzzy line. The most evident example of that in fiction is what we call the cyborg. And that's becoming more and more real because we're seeing mechanical and computer augmentation of people coming back with war wounds. The cyborgs are now real. The more computers that you embed in cybernetic augments, hands, legs, or even part of the brain, in the case of possibly PTSD, there's some talk of using some of these things to offset certain emotional problems. Then you immediately have the possibility of uploading some significant part of that to the cloud, where it's not, you suddenly look at the possibility of having a distributive intelligence which centers on you, but is not all in your cranium. The symbiosis then is evident, because now we ourselves are programming that to do what we want it to do. It's a reflection of our desires, our needs, our intentions. How many people have you ever known that are nothing without their car, emotionally? And that's where the symbiosis, to me, really starts, is when we become emotionally dependent on this. You can replace any piece of machinery and feel absolutely nothing about it, get rid of your computer, get rid of, or in an earlier time, get rid of your typewriter, get rid of anything that but there's always going to be one particular thing that you've imbued with a persona. This is the thing that you use that defines who you are. So now we're looking at building machines that have extremely sophisticated functionality that we're going to be imbuing with that kind of force in our personal lives. So whatever that machine does, the symbiosis is going to be emotional first. And then as we get more and more dependent on it, it's going to be material.
All right, so you very nicely showed how our fantasies about robots, even going back to Mary Shelley, in our fantasies we've projected them to be very anthropomorphic, look like us, they behave like the butler. And yet, maybe without us noticing it, our world has been inundated with robots that really look nothing like our fantasies.
Oh, sure.
Right? So I guess I'm wondering, what is the role for those very anthropomorphic fantasies going forward? And do you think in science fiction, for example, are we ever going to move away from those human-shaped robot fantasies and think about robotics in a less
Well, in
anthropomorphic
science
way?
fiction, we have, as soon as nanotech became one of the magic formula in science fiction stories, we moved away from the anthropomorphic one. But of course, most of the stories had to do with what the nanotech does to us. I mean, you know, for better or worse, literature is anthropocentric. So
Enough about me, what do you think about me?
yeah, enough about me, what do you think about me? What do you think about the new me? Because Greg Bear probably did one of the most interesting extrapolations about the full flower of nanotech in a story called Blood Music, in which humanity's lost all control of it. It's the nanobots are the ones calling the shots, and when they're done, you have a continent-wide superorganism, and there are no, you know, we can do away with the human form. It's inefficient, it doesn't work well. We've improved it as well as we can, but if we're going to take the next step, ditch it. That's a thoroughgoing horror story, because all horror really is about mutilation. When you get right down to it, it's about what something is going to do to us to change who we are and how we perceive ourselves. Lovecraft was great at that. So this kind of a nanotech remake is a horror story.
So I was just actually reading, speaking about nanotech, there's just a story online today. It's May 20th, 2014, so you can just Google it right now. But the very first nanotech workplace injury claim has been filed. And a woman working in a lab was working with nanoscale nickel particles, and nickel, metal particles at the nanoscale have very different functionality, and she didn't realize actually she was interacting with nickel because, of course, she was dealing with this extremely small amount and everything, and she had what looked like a horrible allergic reaction, and they finally figured out what it was, and so she's actually unable to work again in that lab because she now has nanotoxicity.
Oh,
so we've
God.
now had our first work comp claim from Nanotech.
Yeah.
So, it's kind of an interesting, this is a way to kind of explore that, so what does that look like, when you're damaged by something that nobody can see. One of our presenters that couldn't make it today, I mentioned earlier, Eric Luthart, who couldn't make it. Eric is a science fiction writer. He writes, what you might think of as like Michael Crichton-style science fiction, exploring some really interesting ideas. But he also is a neurosurgeon, and he's developing neural implants to do things like help control Parkinson's tremors and help restore movement to people that are paralyzed. And one of the things that he talks about is, his fiction allows him to explore what are the, so if you find this, if you got this thing that you're implanting in the brain and you're doing all the science, it lets him, well, what's the economic or ethical model that fits into in the world? And that's kind of what he thinks his fiction
Right.
lets him explore. What is the most interesting thing that you've seen recently, in this world of robots and our relationship with them, and what does it mean for them to help and to be interdependent with them? What's been kind of like the most interesting thing that that's come up in your writing right now that it's like, wow, that's never really considered the implications of that, or that takes me to a new place.
A robot nanny,
A robot nanny.
which can take any shape or form. It could be the teddy bear. I mean, to an extent, we've already seen something like this. Brian Aldiss wrote a story, Super Toys
Are
last
you going to call it Miss Skinner?
A Skinner bot?
Yeah, Skinnerbot, yeah.
Well, you can easily conceive of people handing their child's upbringing over to an idealized set of programs that are designed to optimize a child's experience and contour its path through life for its own edification. It would be the ideal guardian. It would never be shut off. It would always be there. It would have an automatic link to all of the necessary services. Yeah, I think that this is probably one of the areas where we're going to see a lot of talk about it. And then when one goes wrong, we're going to see a huge amount of litigation, and that's going to be very interesting. Are the parents responsible for buying it, or is the manufacturer responsible for programming
Or was
it
it
wrong?
Babies R Us for selling it?
Or are we going to see a bunch of late life wrongful childhood suits where the child says, or the adult says, I'm the way I am because I never had human affection. All I had was a machine. Which,
Or going to their therapist in their 40s to complain about the algorithms that they were raised by.
exactly. This stuff sounds silly, but it's not that far-fetched. For instance, we're training dogs now to detect epilepsy. They do a whole bunch of other service functions. There's nothing inconceivable about programming machines to do that. Do the
Right.
same thing. You get to a point where the machines protect you from necessary risk. And this is one of the things. There was a comic that I used to love when I was a kid. It was called Magnus Robot Fighter 4000 AD. It was 2,000 years in the future. We have built Asimov's robots to the nth degree, but they've taken their responsibilities too far, and they won't let people do anything. If there's the slightest risk, the robot won't let them do it. So we're stultifying. The whole race is becoming soft. And
We're asking the robots to be wiser than we can be.
we're asking the robots to be wiser than we can be.
That's an interesting question.
And when you look at some of the one of the most interesting books I've read in the last couple of years is Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, and the research that came out of that in how we actually process information and how we actually apply rational thought leads me to believe that a lot of people will say, well, hell, if I can buy a machine that'll do this 24/7, then I can relax.
Right.
You know, I'll program it with a hierarchy tree, and it'll make my decisions for me.
So is anybody, it's kind of funny that you talked about von Neumann in your presentation. One of the things that's happening in the world of computers is, the architecture of the typical computer is a von Neumann architecture, and there's some understanding that that's kind of limiting to think that way, and that there are other models and everything. So do you think that there's a new model of thinking about how we interact with a machine like a robot? Robot is very it packages all kinds of ideas together, but is anybody thinking really differently about that you've seen?
Not specifically that I could mention right now. Probably somebody else could. I'm sure with holographic processing, holographic memory storage, and some of that, there's work in quantum computers now.
Yeah.
That's going to change the whole dynamic, because we're not sure how that's going to play out. This is not an on-off binary system anymore, and that's kind of sort of been the differentiating thing. Very simplistically, the differentiating factor between humans and computers is that while computers are on-off machines, humans are on-off and maybe machines. They have that indeterminate space where they can
And some of us are just mostly maybe.
Some of us are mostly maybe.
Yeah.
But, if you reduce this to a quantum level where you do have that indeterminate factor built into the very processing, you may develop a maybe function in a computer.
So, got a question from somebody else, and they asked, and you kind of teed this up when you were talking about like the dogs that can detect epilepsy. So I'm a caregiver and I have a dog that detects epilepsy. I can accept that I get compensated, and for that I need to take care of the dog.
Right.
That's that I have a relationship there. What happens when I and a robot coworker do things? So if we have Starsky and Hutch is actually a robot. And what happens when the sergeant says, well, I need somebody to work overtime, but I just want Hutch because I don't actually pay his overtime? Or, talk about the economics. How does that start? How's that being explored?
We're looking at that right now, and we're seeing some work that's beginning to emerge because, since 2008, there's been a lot of attention applied to how the new economy is working, and we're still sort of laboring, and I use that word intentionally, under the old model that work needs to be done, and when work is done, then compensation follows. Well, the question now is who does the work? If work needs to be done, and we agree with that, does that necessarily mean a human being has to do the work? We're finding out that no, a human being doesn't have to do it, but then how do you compensate the people that are displaced by that?
Right.
So your situation where Hutch can work 24/7 without maybe plug himself into the wall occasionally is going to displace the human partner a great deal. What does that do to the traditional compensation model? Where does that leave us? But I'm worried, we'll figure that one out. We're looking at a distortion in the economic system right now because we have companies that are starting up, they're being very, very successful, they're making billions and billions of dollars, but the traditional consequence of something like that, which would have been we were hiring thousands of people, isn't happening now because the same 10 people that were there at the beginning of the startup are still the only 10 people there when they're making a success. We don't have to worry about that. It's capital investment, not labor investment. We'll figure that out. But what I'm really worried about is the very human thing of what do you do with people who need something to do? How do you value human creativity?
So idle hands are the devil's playground. Now you're going to.
Yeah.
We're creating billions of devil's playgrounds.
Yeah.
We're gonna wrap up here, and I think this is a perfect point. I want to thank Mark again. Great topic. If you're watching the live stream, this will be archived and will be posted to our site by the end of the week. Also his slides, which are some great illustration and everything. That's wonderful. Will be posted to slides here, so you'll be able to see that. And you have a book coming out. Can you just give us the name of the book and when we can expect to see it?
It's called Gravity Box and Other Spaces. It's a collection of 11 short stories that it's fantasy, science fiction, slipstream, thematically all centered on families.
On families.
On families.
So there we go. So we'll have to figure out, does the robot get invited to the family reunion or not? So when we come back, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, Michael White is going to talk to us about biotech and that space and what we can learn from fiction there. So thank you very much.